They called her Granny behind her back. At 53, with silver streaks threading through her brown hair and reading glasses perched on her nose, Captain Elena Vasquez didn't look like someone who belonged in the cockpit of a commercial airliner. The younger pilots snickered when she walked through the crew lounge, muttering about diversity hires and lowered standards. Then Flight 447 encountered the impossible at 37,000 feet, and those same pilots watched in stunned silence as Elena performed a miracle that would rewrite aviation history. But the real shock came when investigators discovered her personnel file had been sealed for 20 years, and the reason why would leave everyone questioning everything they thought they knew about the quiet woman they'd dismissed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Denver International Airport as Elena Vasquez made her way through the employee entrance. Her uniform was impeccable but unremarkable, the navy blue fabric pressed to perfection, her captain's stripes catching the fluorescent light of the corridor. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to navigate hostile territory without drawing unnecessary attention. The employee break room buzzed with the usual pre-shift energy. Pilots clustered around coffee machines, discussing weather reports and flight plans with the casual confidence of people who had mastered their craft. But when Elena entered, the conversations didn't stop exactly, they just shifted in tone. Became more performative, more pointed. Captain Rick Morrison, a man in his early 40s with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from never having his competence questioned, was holding court near the bulletin board. His voice carried just enough volume to ensure everyone could hear his commentary about the airline's recent hiring practices. "I'm telling you, it's all about optics now," Morrison said, stirring his coffee with unnecessary force. "Doesn't matter if you can actually fly the plane. Just matters what you look like in the company brochures. Pretty soon they'll be pulling flight attendants off the cabin floor and putting them in the left seat." His audience chuckled appreciatively. First Officer Jake Chen, barely 30, with the kind of fresh-faced enthusiasm that hadn't yet been tempered by real experience, nodded along eagerly. "My dad always said aviation was a young man's game. Reflexes slow down after 40. Can't trust your judgment when you're worried about your grandkids instead of focusing on the job." Elena poured herself coffee from the pot in the corner, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She'd heard variations of this conversation dozens of times over the past 3 years since joining Continental Pacific Airways. The comments about her age, her gender, her supposed lack of qualifications. The whispered speculation about how she'd managed to secure a captain's position at a major carrier without the traditional pathway through regional airlines and military service. "Look, I'm not saying women can't fly," Morrison continued, his tone taking on the reasonable quality of someone who thought he was being magnanimous. "But there's a reason 90% of airline pilots are men. It's about upper body strength, spatial reasoning, ability to handle stress. Some things just aren't political correctness problems to solve." Flight attendant supervisor Maria Santos, a woman in her 60s who'd been with the airline for 37 years, looked up from her scheduling tablet. "Elena's been flying for Continental for 3 years now. Haven't heard any complaints about her performance." Morrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course not. Who's going to complain? You write up a diversity hire, suddenly you're the problem. I'm just saying, when something goes wrong up there, you want someone who can handle the real deal. Not someone who got their wings from a Cracker Jack box." Elena had finished preparing her coffee and was reviewing her flight packet when Morrison's words registered. She looked up slowly, her expression unchanged, but something in her posture caught the attention of the room. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that somehow cut through the ambient noise. "Did you have A specific concern about my qualifications, Captain Morrison? The break room went silent. Morrison's face flushed slightly, caught between his conviction and the social awkwardness of being directly confronted. Nothing personal, Elena. Just making observations about industry trends. What trends would those be? Morrison glanced around the room, seeking support from his audience, but finding mostly uncomfortable expressions. Look, we all know the score. Airlines are under pressure to diversify. Sometimes that means experience takes a backseat to demographics. Elena nodded slowly, as if considering his words carefully. I see. And you believe my hire was based on demographics rather than qualifications? I'm not saying that specifically. I'm saying the system has incentives that don't always prioritize the best candidate for the job. What do you consider the best qualifications for a commercial pilot? Morrison straightened, sensing firmer ground. Flight hours, obviously. Military. Experience. Time in complex aircraft. The kind of background that proves you can handle emergencies when everything goes wrong. How many hours do you have, Captain Morrison? 12,000. Plus 8 years military transport. Elena nodded approvingly. Impressive. Very solid foundation. She paused, taking a sip of her coffee. I'm curious, though. What's the most challenging situation you've encountered in the cockpit? Morrison's chest puffed slightly. Had an engine failure over the Pacific 2 years ago. Night flight, weather, single engine approach into San Francisco. Textbook emergency landing. No injuries, minimal damage to the aircraft. That does sound challenging. Quick thinking under pressure is essential in this job. The compliment seemed to mollify Morrison slightly. He relaxed his shoulders, settling back into his familiar role as the room's aviation expert. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Exactly. That's what I'm talking about. When the chips are down, you need someone who's been there before. Someone who knows how to make the hard decisions. Elena finished her coffee and rinsed the cup in the small sink. You're absolutely right. Experience matters tremendously in crisis situations. She gathered her flight materials and headed toward the door, then paused. Captain Morrison, for what it's worth, I think your concerns about pilot qualifications are valid. We should all be held to the highest standards. Morrison nodded, vindicated. Exactly. Nothing personal, you understand. Just professional standards, of course. Professional standards are what keep passengers safe. As Elena left the break room, she could hear Morrison resume his commentary, his voice carrying renewed confidence. See, that's how you handle these situations, direct, professional, no hard feelings. I think she gets it. But Elena wasn't thinking about Morrison's opinion as she made her way through the terminal corridors. She was thinking about Flight 447, a routine Denver to Miami route that would carry 218 passengers and crew. She was thinking about the weather report showing clear skies and favorable winds. She was thinking about the Boeing 767 waiting at Gate B12, its engines already undergoing pre-flight inspection. What she wasn't thinking about was the catastrophic mechanical failure that would occur exactly 2 hours and 14 minutes into the flight, or the impossible decisions that would transform her from the object of workplace mockery into a legend that would be studied in aviation schools for generations. The gate area bustled with typical pre-boarding activity. Passengers checked their phones, wrestled with carry-on luggage, and queued impatiently at the counter. Elena conducted her walk-around inspection of the aircraft with methodical precision, checking everything from tire pressure to control surface movement. Her first officer for the flight was David Park, a competent pilot in his mid-30s who'd been with Continental for 6 years. Park was professional but distant, the kind of cordial reserve that suggested he'd heard the break room gossip and formed his own opinions. He completed his portions of the pre-flight checklist with mechanical efficiency, responding to Elena's questions with brief, correct answers that fulfilled the requirements without inviting conversation. "Weather looks good all the way to Miami," Park said, reviewing the meteorological data. "Some scattered cumulus over the Rockies, but nothing significant. Smooth flight. Good. Let's hope it stays that way." Park glanced at her sideways, perhaps wondering if there was subtext in her comment, but Elena's expression remained neutral. She was studying the aircraft system's display, noting the subtle variations in hydraulic pressure and engine parameters. That told the story of this particular aircraft's mechanical personality. N447CP was a 22-year-old Boeing 767-300 AO with over 40,000 flight hours on its airframe. Not old by commercial aviation standards, but experienced. The maintenance logs showed routine service, no recurring issues, no red flags. A reliable aircraft with a solid service record. Elena's fingers moved across the control panels with practiced precision, setting radio frequencies, programming the flight management system, configuring the autopilot for departure. Each action was deliberate, economical, born from thousands of hours of repetition that had carved neural pathways deep enough to function under any circumstances. "Boarding's complete," announced the ground crew supervisor through the intercom. "Ready for pushback when you are." Elena keyed the radio. "Ground control, Continental 447 ready for pushback and taxi. Gate B12. Continental 447, cleared. For pushback, contact ground 121. 9 when ready to taxi." The familiar ritual of departure began. Pushback, engine start, taxi clearance, runway assignment. Elena's hands moved across the controls with unconscious competence, while her mind processed the stream of information flowing from air traffic control, weather updates, and aircraft systems. Tower cleared them for takeoff on runway 34L. Elena advanced the throttles and felt the familiar acceleration as 200,000 pounds of aircraft gathered speed down the concrete ribbon. At 157 knots, she pulled back on the yoke and Flight 447 lifted off into the crystal clear Colorado morning. The initial climb was routine. Air traffic control vectored them through Denver's complex airspace, past the streams of arrival and departure. Traffic that made DIA one of the busiest airports in the country. Elena engaged the autopilot at 10,000 feet and settled back for what should have been a 3.5-hour flight to Miami. In the cabin, flight attendants began their service. Passengers dozed, read, worked on laptops, or stared out windows at the spectacular Rocky Mountain scenery passing below. A typical Tuesday morning flight, unremarkable in every way except for the cargo of human lives it carried eastward across the continent. Elena monitored the aircraft systems with the peripheral awareness that comes from experience. Engine parameters normal, hydraulic pressures stable, electrical systems functioning within specifications. The 767 was performing flawlessly, its twin engines pushing them smoothly through the thin air at their assigned altitude of 37,000 feet. "Beautiful morning," Park commented, gazing out at the endless expanse of blue sky surrounding them. "Days like this make the job worthwhile." Elena nodded, though her attention remained focused on the instruments. Beautiful weather could turn deadly in minutes at altitude. Clear skies meant nothing when you were traveling at 500 miles per hour in a machine whose failure could kill everyone aboard. "Elena," Park said after a moment, his tone more tentative, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but where did you train? I mean before Continental." It was a question she'd heard dozens of times, always asked with the same careful politeness that suggested the asker had theories they wanted confirmed or dismissed. Elena had developed a standard response that was truthful without being complete. "Various places, took a long path to get here. Military? Some government work. Different kind of flying." Park nodded, apparently satisfied with the non-answer. Government work could mean anything from NOAA weather flights to de-interdiction. Missions, nothing that would raise eyebrows or invite follow-up questions. The flight continued uneventfully as they crossed Colorado and entered Kansas airspace. Elena requested a slight altitude change to avoid some buildups ahead, and air traffic control approved their climb to flight level 390. The 767 responded smoothly, its engines adjusting automatically to maintain their assigned speed. That's when the first warning light appeared on the engine display. It was subtle, just a slight discoloration in the engine temperature reading for the number 2 engine. Not red, not alarming, just different enough to catch Elena's attention. She studied the display for several seconds, noting that all other parameters remained normal. "David, are you seeing anything unusual on the engine display?" Park leaned forward, scanning the instruments. "Everything looks normal to me. What are you seeing?" Elena pointed to the temperature gauge. Number 2 EGTs running slightly warm. Still within limits, but higher than normal for these conditions. Park studied the reading. Could be instrumentation error. "It's only a few degrees. Could be. Let's keep an eye on it." But even as she spoke, Elena felt the subtle wrongness that experienced pilots learn to recognize. The aircraft was still flying normally, all systems functioning within specifications, but something was different. A barely perceptible change in engine harmonics, a slight variation in the way the aircraft responded to control inputs. She began a methodical review of all aircraft systems, checking hydraulic pressures, electrical loads, fuel flow rates, anything that might explain the nagging sense that something was developing. But every reading showed normal operation. Continental 447, Kansas City Center. Turn left heading 090. Descend and maintain flight level 350. Elena acknowledged the clearance and began the turn. As the aircraft rolled into the left bank, she felt it again. A subtle hesitation in the response, as if the aircraft was working harder than it should to maintain the maneuver. "David, does the aircraft feel different to you?" Park shrugged. "Feels normal. Maybe a little turbulence." The temperature warning on the number 2 engine crept higher, still within limits, but definitely trending upward. Elena called up the engine systems page on the flight management display, looking for any indication of developing problems. What she found made her blood run cold. The number 2 engine was showing microscopic variations in all parameters: temperature, pressure, fuel flow, fan speed. Each reading was still within normal limits, but the pattern was unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. The engine was beginning to come apart internally. "David, I need you to pull out the emergency checklist." "Engine failure procedures." Park's head snapped up. "Engine failure? Everything looks normal." "Not failure yet, but something's developing. I want to be prepared." Park reached for the thick manual containing emergency procedures, but before he could open it, the master warning alarm began to sound. Red lights flashed across the engine display as the number 2 engine's parameters suddenly spiked beyond all limits. "Engine fire, engine fire, engine 2, Elena announced, her voice calm and professional despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Her hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, pulling the fire handle, shutting down the engine, activating the fire suppression system. The 767 lurched as the failed engine went silent, its thrust suddenly absent. Elena compensated with rudder input, maintaining control while the aircraft adjusted to single-engine flight. Behind them, passengers felt the sudden change in engine noise and began to stir nervously. Kansas City Center, Continental 447, declaring emergency. "We have an engine fire, engine shutdown, requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport." Continental 447, understand engine fire, stand by for vectors. Are you declaring Mayday? Affirmative, Continental 447 is declaring Mayday. Engine fire, single engine, requesting priority handling. Park was running through the emergency. Checklist, his voice tight with controlled stress. Engine fire checklist complete. Fire indication is out. Single engine approach procedures? Not yet. Let's see what else develops. Elena's instincts were screaming that the engine fire was just the beginning. The pattern of system degradation she'd observed suggested something more fundamental was wrong with the aircraft. But she needed more information before taking drastic action. The information came 30 seconds later, when hydraulic pressure began dropping in two of the aircraft's three independent hydraulic systems. The failure wasn't complete yet, but it was progressing rapidly. Within minutes, they would lose most of their flight controls. David, we're losing hydraulic systems. This isn't just an engine fire. We have major structural damage. Park's face had gone pale. What do you mean structural damage? Elena's mind was processing possibilities at superhuman speed. Engine failure, hydraulic loss, the pattern of system degradation. She'd seen this before, in another aircraft, under circumstances that were classified at the highest levels of government. The combination of failures suggested catastrophic damage to the aircraft's tail section, possibly from uncontained engine debris. The engine failure may have sent debris into the tail. We could be looking at flight control damage, maybe loss of rudder authority. As if summoned by her words, the aircraft suddenly yawed hard to the right. Elena fought the controls, trying to maintain level flight, but the 767 was becoming increasingly difficult to control. The hydraulic pressure readings continued to drop, and warning lights began illuminating across the cockpit like a deadly Christmas tree. Kansas City Center, Continental 447. We have multiple system failures. We're losing flight controls. We need immediate vectors to the nearest airport with emergency equipment standing by. Continental 447. Kansas City International is 30 miles northeast of your position. Runway 01L is available. Emergency equipment is being positioned. Elena looked at the navigation display. 30 miles. At their current speed and rate of descent, they had perhaps 8 minutes to figure out how to land an aircraft that was rapidly becoming unflyable. David, I need you to coordinate with the cabin crew. Tell them to prepare for emergency landing. Brace position, evacuation procedures, the works. This is going to be rough. Park keyed the intercom. Flight attendants to stations, prepare for emergency landing. Flight attendants to stations, prepare for emergency landing. Elena could hear the controlled chaos beginning in the cabin as the flight attendants began their emergency procedures. 218 souls were depending on her ability to solve an impossible problem in the next few minutes. The aircraft lurched again, this time more violently. Elena realized they were losing elevator control as well as rudder. Soon, the only way to control the aircraft would be through engine thrust, a technique that required skills most airline pilots never learned. But Elena had learned those skills in a different life, flying different aircraft under circumstances that officially never happened. She'd spent years mastering the art of flying broken machines, keeping aircraft aloft when every engineering manual said it was impossible. David, I'm going to need you to help me with thrust control. We're going to fly this approach using engine power alone. Park stared at her in disbelief. That's not possible. You can't control a 767 with just engine thrust. Elena's hands moved across the throttle controls with surgical precision, making minute adjustments to the remaining engine's power setting. The aircraft responded sluggishly, but it responded. She could feel the machine's reluctance, its desire to spiral out of control, but she could also feel the edges of possibility. Trust me, David, I've done this before. What she didn't say was that she'd done it in aircraft that were designed for such techniques, with specially modified controls. and years of training in impossible scenarios. She'd done it in situations where failure meant more than passenger casualties, where the stakes were measured in national security and the survival of operations that officially didn't exist. The aircraft was descending through 15,000 feet, still losing hydraulic pressure, still fighting her every input. Elena could feel the machine's death throes, the way its control responses were becoming more erratic with each passing second. Kansas City approach, Continental 447. We're going to need a straight-in approach. No turns, no complex maneuvers. Just point us at the runway and clear everything out of our way. Continental 447, understand straight-in approach. You're cleared. For runway 01L, all traffic is being held. Emergency equipment is standing by. Elena began the most delicate process of her aviation career. Using only engine thrust and the aircraft's diminishing control authority, she had to guide 200,000 pounds of dying machine to a safe landing. The margin for error was non-existent. Too much power, and they'd overshoot the runway. Too little, and they'd crash short. David, I need you to call out airspeed and altitude. Don't give me anything else unless I ask for it. Park's voice was tight but professional. 190 knots, 12,000 feet. Elena made microscopic adjustments to the throttle, feeling the aircraft's response through her fingertips. The 767 wanted to spiral into an uncontrolled descent, but she was holding it in a shallow glide path through pure force of will and technique that shouldn't have been possible. 180 knots, 10,000 feet. The runway was visible ahead, a thin strip of concrete that looked impossibly small for their crippled aircraft. Elena could see the emergency vehicles positioned along the taxiways, their red and white lights flashing in the afternoon sun. 170 knots, 8,000 feet. The aircraft shuddered as another hydraulic system failed completely. Elena felt the controls go slack in her hands, the aircraft becoming a barely controlled projectile falling toward the earth. But she maintained the glide path, adjusting engine thrust with the precision of a surgeon, keeping them aligned with the runway centerline. 160 knots, 6,000 feet. Elena could see faces in the terminal windows, people watching their approach with the fascination of witnessing something that defied explanation. She could feel the aircraft's instability increasing with each passing second, the machine's desire to roll inverted and plummet to earth. 150 knots, 4,000 feet. The runway was growing larger, but Elena realized they were coming in too fast and too high. A normal approach would require them to reduce power and descend more steeply, but any significant power reduction would cause them to lose control completely. David, we're going to land long. Tell the tower we'll need the full runway length. Park keyed the radio. Kansas City Tower, Continental 447 will be landing long. Request full runway length. Continental 447, runway 01L is 14,000 feet long. You have full length available. Elena felt a moment of relief. 14,000 feet was enough runway to handle their high-speed approach, assuming she could keep the aircraft under control during the landing roll. 140 knots, 2,000 feet. The aircraft was fighting her more violently, now trying to roll left into the failed engine. Elena countered with minute throttle adjustments, keeping them aligned with the runway through techniques that existed at the very edge of aerodynamic possibility. 130 knots, 1,000 feet. The runway filled their windscreen. Elena could see the touchdown zone markers, the precision approach path indicators showing they were slightly high but within acceptable limits. The aircraft shuddered. Again, another system failing, but they were too close to the runway now for it to matter. 120 knots, 500 feet. Elena began to reduce power slowly, feeling the aircraft's response change as they approached the ground. The runway was rushing toward them at tremendous speed, but she maintained the delicate balance between control and catastrophe. 110 knots, 100 feet. The aircraft crossed the runway threshold at exactly the moment Elena cut power to idle. The main landing gear touched down with a tremendous thump, the aircraft bouncing once before settling onto the concrete. Elena deployed the speed brakes and reverse thrust, fighting to keep the aircraft centered on the runway as it decelerated. Behind them, the passengers erupted in cheers and applause as they realized they were safely on the ground. The flight attendants began their post-landing procedures, checking for injuries and preparing for possible evacuation. Elena brought the aircraft to a complete stop just short of the runway's end. Emergency vehicles surrounded them immediately. Firefighters and paramedics ready to respond to whatever they might find. But there were no injuries, no fire, no secondary emergencies. Just 218 people who had witnessed something that would be studied and analyzed for decades to come. Kansas City ground, Continental 447, were stopped on the runway. Request emergency equipment to check the aircraft before. We taxied to the gate. Continental 447, emergency equipment is on scene. Remain in position until they give you the all clear. Elena shut down the remaining engine and began the post-flight checklist. Her hands were steady, her voice calm. But inside she was processing the magnitude of what had just happened. She'd landed an aircraft that should have been uncontrollable, saved lives that should have been lost, performed a feat of airmanship that existed at the very boundaries of human capability. Park was staring at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Not the polite distance of their previous interactions, but something approaching awe. How did you do that? How did you know how to fly the aircraft with just engine thrust? Elena finished the checklist before answering. Experience. Different kind of flying. What kind of experience teaches you to land a crippled airliner? Before Elena could respond, the cockpit door opened and the lead flight attendant entered. She was a woman in her 40s named Jennifer Walsh, who'd been with Continental for 15 years and had never experienced anything like what had just happened. Captain, the passengers are asking if they can thank you personally. They want to know how you managed to land the aircraft. Elena was already gathering her flight materials, preparing to leave the cockpit. Tell them it was a team effort. Everyone did their job. Captain, with all due respect, what you just did was impossible. I've been flying for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like that. Elena paused in her preparations. Jennifer, would you mind handling the passenger disembarkation? I need to coordinate with the emergency response team. Walsh nodded, recognizing the dismissal. But as she turned to leave, she spoke again. Captain, I don't know what your background is, but today you saved every life on this aircraft. That's not something that happens by accident. After Walsh left, Elena and Park completed their shutdown procedures in relative silence. The emergency responders had cleared the aircraft for taxi, and ground control was directing them to a remote gate where investigators would begin their examination of the failed systems. As they taxied slowly across the airport, Elena could see news crews gathering at the terminal. Word had already spread about the emergency landing, and reporters were eager to learn the details of what had happened. Elena knew she'd have to face questions eventually, but for now she was content to focus on the routine tasks of post-flight procedures. Elena, Park said as they approached the gate, I owe you an apology. I heard the talk in the crew room, and I bought into it. I thought you were just another diversity hire who didn't belong in the cockpit. Elena didn't respond immediately. She was watching the ground crew marshaling them into the gate, noting the additional security personnel who had been positioned around the aircraft. David, experience comes from a lot of different places. Sometimes it's not the kind of experience that shows up on a resume. What kind of experience were you talking about when you said you'd done this before? Elena shut down the aircraft's electrical systems and began gathering her flight bag. The kind that's hard to explain. As they prepared to leave the cockpit, Elena noticed two men in dark suits waiting in the jetway. They had the unmistakable bearing of federal agents, and their presence confirmed what she'd suspected since the moment she'd recognized the pattern of system failures. Someone was about to ask questions that would require answers she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. The passenger disembarkation proceeded smoothly, with many travelers stopping to thank Elena personally as they left the aircraft. Their gratitude was genuine and heartfelt, but Elena found herself focusing on the two men in suits who remained in the jetway as the last passenger departed. "Captain Vasquez," the taller agent said as she approached. "I'm Agent Robert Harrison, FBI. This is Agent Sarah Mitchell, NTSB. We'd like to speak with you about the incident." Elena nodded, unsurprised by their presence. "Of course. Should I contact my union representative?" "That's your right, but this is just a preliminary discussion. We're trying to understand what happened up there." Elena followed the agents to a quiet conference room in the airport's administrative section. The space was sterile and functional, with a table, chairs, and a whiteboard that someone had forgotten to erase. Agent Harrison activated a digital recorder and placed it on the table. "Captain, can you walk us through the sequence of events that led to the emergency landing?" Elena provided a detailed account of the flight, from the initial engine temperature anomaly through the final touchdown. She was precise and professional, sticking to observable facts and avoiding speculation about causes or implications. "Captain," Agent Mitchell interjected, "you mentioned that you recognized the pattern of system failures. Can you elaborate on that?" Elena hesitated for the first time in the interview. The combination of engine failure and hydraulic loss suggested possible debris damage to the tail section. "It's a scenario covered in our training, is it? Because I've spoken with several airline pilots about this type of failure, and none of them indicated they'd ever trained for multiple hydraulic system loss combined with flight control degradation." Elena met the agent's gaze steadily. "Different. Pilots have different training backgrounds." Agent Harrison leaned forward. "Captain, we've reviewed your personnel file with Continental Pacific Airways. It shows you joining the company 3 years ago with the minimum required flight hours for a captain's position. No military background, no previous airline experience. Yet today you demonstrated skills that suggest extensive training in unusual aircraft control techniques." Elena had been expecting this conversation for 3 years. "Agent Harrison, I've been flying for over 20 years. Not all of that experience is reflected in my Continental personnel file." "What experience isn't reflected?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, weighing her response. "Agent Harrison, I think you should check with your supervisors before we continue this conversation. My previous employment may require clearances that haven't been established." The two agents exchanged glances. Agent Mitchell made a note on her pad, then looked back at Elena. "Captain, are you suggesting your previous employment was classified?" "I'm suggesting you should verify what you're authorized to discuss." Before we proceed, Agent Harrison reached for his phone. "Excuse me for a moment." He stepped out of the room, leaving Elena alone with Agent Mitchell. "Captain, off the record, what you did today was extraordinary. I've been investigating aviation accidents for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like that landing." "The aircraft should have been uncontrollable." Elena nodded. "We were fortunate." "Fortunate?" "Captain, you landed a crippled aircraft using techniques that aren't taught in any civilian training program. That's not fortune. That's skill." Before Elena could respond, Agent Harrison returned to the room. His expression had changed noticeably. "Captain, I've been instructed to suspend this interview pending clearance from Washington. You're free to go, but we may need to speak with you again." Elena stood to leave, then paused. "Agent Harrison, the passengers and crew on that aircraft deserve to know what caused the failure. I hope your investigation provides those answers." "Captain, one more question. Is there anything about today's incident that we should be aware?" From a national security perspective? Elena considered the question carefully. Agent Harrison, the aircraft failed catastrophically due to what appears to be an uncontained engine failure. The fact that we were able to land safely doesn't change the underlying cause. Your investigation should focus on why the engine failed, and whether there are implications for other aircraft of the same type. As Elena left the conference room, she could hear Agent Harrison making another phone call. She knew that within hours, people she'd hoped never to deal with again would be asking questions about her presence on Flight 447 and whether her actions had compromised operations that officially didn't exist. The terminal corridor was busy with afternoon passenger traffic, but Elena noticed additional security personnel positioned at key locations. Her emergency landing had attracted attention from multiple agencies, and she suspected the investigation would extend far beyond the normal scope of aircraft accident analysis. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Coffee shop, Concourse C, 30 minutes. Come alone. Elena recognized the sender immediately. Marcus Webb, her former handler from the years when she'd flown aircraft that didn't appear on any civilian registration rolls. If Marcus was here, it meant Washington was already mobilizing to contain whatever implications her actions might have created. She made her way through the terminal toward Concourse C, noting the subtle surveillance that had been established around her movements. Professional watchers positioned to appear casual while maintaining visual contact. She'd been out of the game for 3 years, but the skills of detecting and evading surveillance remained sharp. The coffee shop was crowded with travelers, providing good cover for a clandestine meeting. Elena spotted Marcus immediately, though he'd aged considerably since their last encounter. His hair was completely gray now, and his face carried the lines of someone who'd spent too many years managing impossible situations. Elena. He stood as she approached, embracing her briefly in a gesture that appeared friendly while allowing him to check for surveillance devices. You look well. Marcus, I wondered when you'd show up. They sat at a corner table with clear sight lines to all entrances. Marcus ordered coffee for both of them, then leaned forward slightly. That was quite a performance today. Made all the news networks. It was an emergency landing, nothing more. Elena, you know better than that. You use techniques that aren't taught in civilian aviation. People are asking questions. Elena sipped her coffee, considering her response. What kind of questions? The kind that could compromise operations that are still active. The kind that could put people in danger. Elena felt the familiar weight of secrets that couldn't be shared. Operations that couldn't be acknowledged. Skills that couldn't be explained. Marcus, I've been out for 3 years. I haven't compromised anything. You saved 200 lives today using skills you learned in programs that don't exist. That's a problem. The alternative was letting those people die. Marcus nodded slowly. I know, and that's why we have a problem. You made the right choice as a pilot, but it created complications for the community. Elena understood the euphemism. The community was the collection of agencies and programs that operated in the shadows, conducting missions that required official deniability and complete operational security. Her actions today had demonstrated skills that could only have been learned in those programs. What do you need from me? Cooperation. The FBI and NTSB are investigating the incident. They're going to want to know where you learned to fly. Crippled aircraft. We need to manage that conversation. Meaning? Meaning we need to construct a plausible background that explains your skills without revealing their actual source. Something that satisfies the investigators without compromising ongoing operations. Elena had been dreading this conversation for 3 years. When she'd left the community, she'd hoped to disappear completely into civilian life. But deep down, she'd known that her skills were too specialized, too unusual, to remain hidden forever. What are you proposing? Marcus slid a manila folder across the table. Test pilot background. Experimental Aircraft Program. Officially ended 10 years ago, but it would explain your unusual training. The documentation Marcus provided was comprehensive and convincing. Elena studied the fabricated records that would transform her from a mysterious civilian contractor into a former test pilot with extensive experience in experimental aircraft control systems. The background was plausible enough to satisfy investigators, while remaining vague enough to discourage deeper inquiry. "This will work for the formal investigation," Elena said, closing the folder. "But what about the people who were in that cockpit with me? David Park knows what he saw. He knows those weren't standard procedures." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "First Officer Park will receive a briefing about the classified nature of certain advanced pilot training programs. He'll understand that discussing specific techniques could compromise national security interests. Most pilots are patriotic enough to accept those boundaries." Elena felt the familiar unease that came with managing operational security through controlled deception. "And if he doesn't accept those boundaries? Then we'll have a different conversation. But Park seems like a reasonable man. I think he'll understand the importance of discretion." The coffee shop bustled around them with the normal chaos of airport life. Travelers hurried past with rolling luggage. Children complained about delayed flights. Business travelers conducted phone meetings while waiting for connections. The ordinary drama of civilian aviation, far removed from the shadow world where Elena had spent the most intense years of her career. "Marcus, I need to ask you something. Today's engine failure, the pattern of system degradation, it reminded me of the Blackwater incident." Marcus's expression didn't change, but Elena caught the slight tightening around his eyes. The Blackwater incident was classified at levels that transcended normal government security protocols. It involved experimental aircraft, foreign adversaries, and techniques that pushed the boundaries of physics and human endurance. "Elena, Blackwater was 12 years ago. Different aircraft, different circumstances, same failure pattern. Catastrophic engine destruction followed by progressive hydraulic loss and flight control degradation. The only reason I knew how to handle today's emergency was because I'd seen it before." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing implications that Elena could only guess at. "Are you suggesting today's incident wasn't accidental?" "I'm suggesting the similarities are worth investigating. If someone has developed the capability to remotely trigger the kind of failures we saw in Blackwater, civilian aviation could be vulnerable. The possibility hung between them like a toxic cloud. If hostile actors had somehow replicated or stolen the technology that had been used in the Blackwater program, every commercial flight could become a potential target. The implications for national security and public safety were staggering. Elena, if you're right, this conversation never happened. The investigation proceeds normally. You cooperate fully with the cover story, and we handle the deeper implications through other channels." Elena understood. Her role was to be the heroic pilot who saved her passengers through skill and quick thinking. The real investigation into possible sabotage or terrorism would happen in offices that didn't officially exist, conducted by people whose names appeared on no government roster. "I need something in return, Marcus. If this investigation reveals that civilian aircraft are being targeted, I want to know. These people trusted me to keep them safe. If there's an ongoing threat, they deserve to be protected." Marcus finished his coffee and stood to leave. "Elena, you've been out of the community for 3 years. You've built a new life, found a different purpose. Don't let today pull you back into a world you worked so hard to escape. I didn't ask to be pulled back. But if people are being targeted, if my passengers were chosen for some reason, I need to know. Your passengers were random travelers on a routine commercial flight, nothing more." But Elena caught the hesitation in his response, the careful phrasing that suggested there might be more to investigate. She'd spent enough years reading between the lines of official statements to recognize when important information was being withheld. Marcus, was anyone on that flight particularly interesting from a security perspective? Elena, you're asking questions that lead to answers you don't want to know. Go home, resume your normal life. Let the professionals handle whatever implications today's incident might have. As Marcus walked away, Elena remained at the coffee shop table, processing the conversation and its implications. She'd hoped to leave her past completely behind, but today's emergency had demonstrated that some skills never really disappeared. More troubling, it had raised questions about whether her past might be pursuing her into civilian life. Her phone buzzed with another message, this one from Captain Morrison. Elena, heard about your emergency landing. Incredible flying. Drinks on me next time you're in Denver. Elena almost smiled at the transformation in Morrison's attitude. A few hours ago, he'd been questioning her qualifications and suggesting she was a diversity hire. Now he was buying her drinks and praising her airmanship. The aviation community was small enough that news of her emergency landing would spread quickly through pilot networks. But Elena was more concerned about the other networks that would be analyzing today's events. Intelligence agencies, foreign adversaries, criminal organizations that might have interests in commercial aviation vulnerabilities. If her suspicions about the failure pattern were correct, Flight 447 might have been a test of capabilities that could be used for much larger attacks. Elena left the coffee shop and made her way toward the airport exit. She needed to return to her hotel, process the day's events, and prepare for what would undoubtedly be an extensive investigation. But as she walked through the terminal, she noticed the surveillance had intensified. Professional watchers were positioned at regular intervals, maintaining visual contact while attempting to appear casual. Elena recognized the techniques from her own training, the way operatives could blend into civilian environments while conducting sophisticated surveillance operations. The hotel shuttle arrived precisely on schedule, and Elena settled into a window seat for the short ride to her accommodation. The driver was chatty, commenting on the emergency landing that had dominated local news coverage. He'd seen the aircraft approach from the hotel parking lot and was impressed by the pilot's skill in bringing such a damaged plane safely to ground. Must have been some kind of pilot, the driver said, glancing at Elena in the rearview mirror. News said it was a woman captain. Pretty unusual for the airlines. Elena nodded noncommittally. Aviation is becoming more diverse. Yeah, but this was something special. Reporters said the plane shouldn't have been flyable. Takes real skill to pull off something like that. Elena gazed out the window at the Kansas landscape, processing the public perception of today's events. To most observers, it was a story of heroism and professional competence under pressure. They had no way of knowing about the deeper implications that might be developing behind the scenes. The hotel room was standard business accommodation. Functional but comfortable. Elena ordered room service and settled down to review the events of the day in detail. She needed to document everything she could remember about the failure sequence, the aircraft's response characteristics, and the techniques she'd used to maintain control. If her suspicions about the Blackwater connection were correct, this information might be crucial for preventing future attacks. But she also needed to be careful about how she documented her observations. Too much detail about her emergency procedures could raise questions about her background that the cover story might not adequately address. Her laptop contained encrypted files from her previous career, information that she'd retained despite official requirements to surrender. All classified materials upon separation. The files included technical specifications for experimental aircraft, emergency procedures for impossible situations, and contact information for people who officially didn't exist. Elena accessed the files using security protocols that she'd hoped never to need again. The information confirmed her suspicions about the failure pattern. The progressive system degradation that had nearly destroyed Flight 447 was virtually identical to failures that had been deliberately induced during classified testing programs. The implications were staggering. If someone had weaponized the techniques developed in those programs, any commercial aircraft could be turned into a potential catastrophe. Hundreds of flights operated daily with vulnerable systems that could be exploited by adversaries with the right knowledge and capabilities. Elena composed a carefully worded email to an encrypted address that she'd memorized years earlier. The message contained technical details about today's incident, coded references to the Blackwater program, and a request for threat assessment regarding civilian aviation vulnerabilities. The response arrived within minutes. Package received. Analysis underway. Maintain operational security. Will contact through established protocols if further information required. Elena deleted the email exchange and closed the encrypted files. She'd done what she could to alert the community about potential threats. Now she had to focus on managing the official investigation without compromising operations that might be critical to national security. Room service arrived with a dinner that Elena barely tasted. Her mind was processing the complex dynamics of her situation. She was simultaneously a hero pilot who'd saved passenger lives and a potential security risk whose actions had demonstrated capabilities that officially didn't exist. The television news coverage of Flight 447 dominated the evening broadcasts. Aviation experts analyzed the emergency landing, praising Elena's skill while acknowledging that her techniques were unusual for commercial aviation. Several former military pilots interviewed by reporters suggested that Elena must have had specialized training beyond typical airline requirements. Elena's phone rang with a call from Continental Pacific Airways chief pilot, Captain Robert Chen. He was calling to congratulate her on the successful emergency landing and to discuss the upcoming investigation procedures. "Elena, what you did today was extraordinary. I've been flying for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like that approach. The company is proud to have you as part of our team." Elena appreciated the support, but she was more interested in Chen's insights into the investigation process. "Robert, what should I expect from the NTSB inquiry?" "Standard procedures. Initially, they'll want detailed statements from you and First Officer Park, review of aircraft maintenance records, analysis of the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder. But given the unusual nature of the emergency, they might expand the investigation to include additional agencies." Elena had expected as much. What kind of additional agencies? "FBI will probably get involved if there's any suggestion of sabotage or security issues. FAA will certainly review pilot training requirements and emergency procedures. Could even involve TSA if they suspect any security vulnerabilities." The conversation continued for another 15 minutes with Chen, providing guidance on media relations and company procedures for major incidents. Elena listened carefully, taking notes on the official narrative that would emerge from the investigation. After ending the call, Elena reviewed the test pilot cover story that Marcus had provided. The documentation was thorough, including training records, performance evaluations, and technical reports that would support her claimed background in experimental aircraft programs. But Elena knew the story would only hold up under routine scrutiny. If investigators decided to dig deeper, if they contacted the wrong people or asked the wrong questions, the fabricated background could unravel quickly. The community's ability to maintain operational security depended on controlling the scope and direction of official inquiries. Elena's laptop chimed with an encrypted message notification. The sender was identified only as Phoenix, a code name she recognized from her previous career. Phoenix had been a technical analyst specializing in aircraft systems vulnerabilities, someone who understood the intersection of aviation technology and national security threats. The message was brief. Preliminary analysis suggests external interference possible. Recommend enhanced security protocols for all personnel associated with incident. Further briefing scheduled for 0800 tomorrow, location to be determined. Elena deleted the message and considered its implications. If Phoenix was correct about external interference, Flight 447 might have been deliberately targeted. The question was whether Elena herself had been the target, or whether the attack was aimed at other passengers or the aircraft systems themselves. She reviewed the passenger manifest that had been included in her flight materials. 218 names representing a cross-section of American society. Business travelers, families on vacation, students returning to college, retirees, visiting relatives. Nothing that immediately suggested high-value targets or security concerns. But Elena knew that appearances could be deceiving. Intelligence operatives, corporate executives with sensitive information, government officials traveling under assumed identities, could all be hidden among the ordinary passengers. If the attack had been targeted, identifying the intended victim might be crucial for preventing future incidents. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from David Park. "Elena, I keep thinking about what happened today. The way you handled that aircraft, those weren't techniques I've ever seen before. I have questions, but I'm getting the feeling I shouldn't ask them." Elena considered her response carefully. Park was an intelligent pilot who'd witnessed capabilities that didn't match her official background. He deserved some kind of explanation, but she had to balance his curiosity against operational security requirements. She replied, "David, sometimes pilots have training backgrounds that aren't fully reflected in their personnel files. What matters is that everyone got home safely today." Park's response came quickly, "Understood. But if there's ever anything you can share about where you learned those techniques, I'd be interested. What you did today could save lives in future emergencies." Elena appreciated Park's discretion, but his interest in her background remained a potential security concern. If he became too curious, if he started researching her history or discussing her techniques with other pilots, it could draw unwanted attention to her previous career. The evening news coverage continued with expanded reporting on Flight 447. Aviation safety experts were analyzing the emergency landing, while passengers shared their experiences of the terrifying flight and miraculous survival. Elena listened to their accounts with mixed emotions, proud of her role in saving their lives, but concerned about the growing public attention. One passenger interview caught her particular attention. A man named Dr. Richard Sterling, a university professor traveling to Miami for an academic conference, described the emergency with unusual technical precision. His account of the aircraft's behavior during the approach suggested knowledge of aviation systems that went beyond typical passenger awareness. Elena made a note of Sterling's name and credentials. If Flight 447 had been deliberately targeted, passengers with specialized knowledge or sensitive information might be relevant to understanding the motivation behind the attack. Her laptop chimed again with another encrypted message, this one from Marcus. Sterling flagged for additional review. Academic background includes aerospace engineering and government consulting. May be relevant to threat assessment. Elena wasn't surprised that the community was already analyzing passenger backgrounds for potential connections to the incident. If Flight 447 had been attacked, understanding why it was chosen could prevent future targeting of civilian aircraft. The hotel room felt increasingly confining as Elena processed the implications of the day's events. She'd left her previous career specifically to avoid the constant tension of operational security and threat assessment. Civilian aviation was supposed to be routine, predictable, free from the complexities of national security considerations. But today had demonstrated that her past couldn't be completely escaped. The skills she'd learned in classified programs had saved passenger lives, but they'd also raised questions that could compromise ongoing operations. She was caught between her responsibility to her passengers and her obligations to the community that had trained her. Elena opened her laptop and began composing a detailed report of the Flight 447 incident. The document would provide technical analysis of the emergency for use by investigators while carefully avoiding any information that could compromise classified programs. It was a delicate balance between transparency and operational security. The report included detailed descriptions of the failure sequence, aircraft performance characteristics, and emergency procedures used during the approach and landing. Elena was careful to frame her actions in terms of standard aviation practices, while omitting specific references to techniques that were unique to classified training programs. She also included her observations about the similarity between today's failures and patterns she'd encountered in her previous career. The information was coded in language that would be meaningful to community analysts while appearing routine to civilian investigators. Elena encrypted the report and transmitted it through secure channels to addresses that would ensure distribution to relevant agencies. The document would become part of the official record, while also providing intelligence assessment capabilities with the information they needed to evaluate potential threats. As she finished the report, Elena reflected on the transformation that had occurred in her life over the past 12 hours. This morning, she'd been a commercial airline pilot dealing with workplace discrimination and career challenges. Tonight, she was a central figure in what might be a national security investigation with implications for aviation safety worldwide. The television coverage had shifted to analysis of aircraft safety systems and pilot training requirements. Aviation experts were debating whether commercial pilots needed additional training in unusual emergency procedures, while industry representatives defended current certification standards. Elena knew the debate would intensify as details of her background emerged. If investigators discovered her connection to classified programs, it would raise questions about whether civilian pilots were adequately prepared for sophisticated attacks on aircraft systems. Her phone rang with a call from her sister Maria, who lived in Phoenix and had seen the news coverage of Flight 447. Maria was calling to check on Elena's well-being and to express pride in her heroic actions. "Elena, I saw you on the news. Mom would have been so proud. You saved all those people's lives." Elena appreciated her sister's support, but the reference to their mother brought complicated emotions. Their mother had been a military nurse who died in a training accident when Elena was in college. The loss had influenced Elena's decision to pursue a career in aviation, seeking to honor her mother's service through her own contribution to protecting lives. "It was just doing my job, Maria. Any pilot would have done the same thing." "Elena, the experts on TV are saying what you did was impossible. They're calling it a miracle." Elena didn't want to discuss the technical aspects of the emergency with her sister, but she appreciated the family connection in the midst of the professional chaos surrounding the incident. "Maria, I might be dealing with investigations and media attention for a while. If reporters contact you or other family members, just tell them you're proud of me, but don't know details about my professional background." Maria understood the request and promised to protect Elena's privacy. But the conversation reminded Elena of another dimension to her security concerns. Her family members could become targets for information gathering if hostile actors were interested in her background or capabilities. Elena made another encrypted call to Marcus, requesting security assessments for her immediate family members. The community had protocols for protecting the relatives of operatives whose identities might be compromised, and Elena wanted to ensure her family's safety while the investigation proceeded. The late evening news included an interview with Captain Morrison, who had been contacted by reporters seeking information about Elena's reputation among her peers. Morrison's comments were supportive but vague, describing Elena as a competent pilot without providing specific details about her background or training. Elena was gratified by Morrison's discretion, especially considering his earlier skepticism about her qualifications. The emergency landing had clearly changed his perception of her abilities, but he was being careful not to fuel speculation about her unusual skills. As midnight approached, Elena prepared for what would likely be a sleepless night of processing the day's events and preparing for tomorrow's challenges. The investigation would intensify, media attention would increase, and the community would continue analyzing threats and vulnerabilities associated with the incident. Elena reviewed her schedule for the following day. The NTSB interview was scheduled for 10 in the morning, followed by meetings with Continental Pacific Airways, management, and potentially additional sessions with federal investigators. She needed to be prepared for detailed questions about her background, training, and decision-making during the emergency. The test pilot cover story would provide a framework for answering most questions, but Elena knew that sophisticated investigators might probe for inconsistencies or gaps in the narrative. She needed to be thoroughly familiar with every detail of the fabricated background to maintain credibility under intense scrutiny. Elena's phone buzzed with a final encrypted message of the day: threat assessment ongoing. Preliminary indicators suggest possible state actor involvement. Enhanced security protocols authorized for all personnel associated with incident. Briefing tomorrow will include updated threat analysis and operational guidance. The message confirmed Elena's suspicions about the seriousness of the investigation. If state actors were potentially involved in attacking civilian aircraft, the implications extended far beyond a single emergency landing. The community would be mobilizing significant resources to assess and counter whatever threat had emerged. Elena secured her laptop and prepared for bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and potentially dangerous revelations. She'd entered this day as a commercial pilot dealing with routine workplace issues. She was ending it as a central figure in what might be a national security crisis, with global implications for aviation safety. The irony wasn't lost on her that trying to escape her past had ultimately led her back into the world she'd worked so hard to leave behind. But as she reflected on the faces of the passengers she'd saved, Elena knew she'd made the right choice in using whatever skills were necessary to protect their lives. The investigation would continue, threats would be assessed, and security measures would be implemented. But tonight, 218 people were safe with their families because Elena had been in the right place at the right time with the right skills to make the impossible possible. As she drifted towards sleep, Elena wondered whether this was truly the end of her involvement in the community's activities, or whether today's events had marked the beginning of a new chapter in a career she'd thought was permanently concluded. The morning would bring answers to some of those questions, but for now, Elena allowed herself the satisfaction of knowing that her actions had made a difference in the lives of people who would never fully understand the complexity of what had saved them. The morning briefing took place in a nondescript office building 20 minutes from the airport. Elena arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, noting the enhanced security measures that had been implemented overnight. Armed guards at the entrance, multiple identification checkpoints, and surveillance equipment that belonged in classified facilities rather than civilian buildings. Phoenix turned out to be Dr. Catherine Wells, a woman in her mid-40s with the intense focus of someone who'd spent decades analyzing threats that most people couldn't imagine. She greeted Elena with professional courtesy but wasted no time on pleasantries. The preliminary analysis confirms your suspicions about external interference, Wells began, activating a secure display system. The failure pattern on flight 447 matches signatures we've seen in 3 other incidents over the past 18 months. Elena studied the technical data appearing on the screen. Engine degradation curves, hydraulic pressure loss rates, and electrical system anomalies that formed a distinctive pattern. The similarities were too precise to be coincidental. 3 other incidents, Elena repeated. Were there casualties? 2 resulted in total loss of aircraft and crew. The third was a cargo flight where the crew managed an emergency landing, but the aircraft was destroyed during the landing roll. Flight 447 is the first time anyone has successfully recovered from this type of attack. The word attack hung in the air like a death sentence. Elena had suspected sabotage, but hearing it confirmed transformed today's emergency from a heroic rescue into something much more sinister. Do we know who's responsible? Wells manipulated the display to show a world map with incident locations, marked in red. The geographic distribution suggests a sophisticated organization with global reach. The technical capabilities required indicate state-level resources or a very well-funded terrorist network. Elena studied the pattern of attacks. Commercial flights from different countries, different aircraft types, but all sharing the same failure characteristics. What's the connection between the targeted flights? That's what we're trying to determine. Passenger manifests, flight routes, aircraft ownership, crew backgrounds. We're analyzing every variable to understand the selection criteria. Wells brought up passenger information for Flight 447, including the enhanced background checks that had been conducted overnight. Dr. Richard Sterling's name was highlighted in red, indicating special interest. Sterling has been consulting for the Defense Department on aircraft vulnerability assessments, Wells explained. His research involves exactly the kind of system integration that's being exploited in these attacks. Elena felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. So, he wasn't just a random passenger. He was a target, possibly. But there's another complication. Sterling's research is classified, and very few people knew about his travel plans. If he was specifically targeted, it suggests the attackers have access to highly sensitive information about Defense Department operations. The implications were staggering. Not only were civilian aircraft being attacked with sophisticated weapons, but the attackers apparently had intelligence sources within the U.S. government. Elena realized she'd stumbled into something much larger than a simple terrorism investigation. "What's my role in this?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Wells smiled grimly. "You're the only pilot who successfully countered one of these attacks. Your emergency procedures worked because they were based on training that doesn't officially exist. We need to understand exactly what you did so we can develop countermeasures for other pilots." Elena understood the request, but she also understood its implications. Sharing her emergency techniques would require revealing training methods from classified programs. The community would be asking her to compromise operational security to protect civilian aviation. "Catherine, the techniques I used were developed for very specific aircraft under very specific circumstances. I'm not sure they're applicable to standard commercial operations, maybe not directly, but the principles behind them could be adapted for civilian use. We're talking about saving thousands of lives if these attacks continue." Elena considered the moral calculus involved. Protecting classified information versus protecting innocent passengers. Maintaining operational security versus preventing future catastrophes. The decision would have far-reaching consequences. Regardless of what she chose, I'll need authorization from the appropriate levels before I can share specific technical details. Wells nodded. "That's being arranged. But Elena, I need you to understand something. Based on the attack pattern and the intelligence requirements involved, we believe you're now a high-value target yourself." Elena had been expecting this development. "Because I successfully countered their weapon. Because you demonstrated capabilities they didn't expect to encounter. You've proven that their attacks can be defeated, which makes you both an asset to us and a threat to them." Wells activated another display showing security assessments and threat indicators. Elena's threat level had been elevated to the highest categories, indicating that hostile actors were likely to attempt elimination or capture operations. What kind of protection are we talking about? Full community support. New identity if necessary, relocation, family protection. Whatever it takes to keep you safe while we develop countermeasures and identify the attackers. Elena thought about her sister Maria, her quiet life as a commercial pilot, the normalcy she'd worked so hard to build over the past 3 years. All of it would disappear if she accepted community protection. She'd be back in the shadow world permanently, trading her civilian identity for security that might not even be effective. Catherine, what if I just walk away? Resign from Continental? Disappear into civilian life? Let someone else handle the investigation? Wells looked at her with something approaching sympathy. Elena, they know who you are now. Your performance yesterday demonstrated skills that only a handful of people in the world possess. Walking away won't make you less of a target. It will just make you a target without protection. The logic was inescapable. Elena's decision to save her passengers had irrevocably exposed her to dangers that civilian life couldn't defend against. She was caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, protected adequately by none. How long do I have to decide? The NTSB interview is in 2 hours. You'll need to use the test pilot cover story, but you'll also need to be prepared for questions that might probe deeper. If investigators become suspicious about your background, it could compromise both your safety and ongoing operations. Elena stood to leave, processing the complexity of her situation. Catherine, if I agree to full community support, what happens to my civilian identity? Can I ever go back to being just an airline pilot? That depends on how this investigation develops and whether we can neutralize the threat. But Elena, I need to be honest with you. People with your capabilities don't usually get to retire completely. There's always another crisis, another situation where those skills become necessary. As Elena left the briefing, she understood that yesterday's emergency landing had fundamentally changed her life trajectory. She could no longer pretend to be an ordinary commercial pilot with an unremarkable background. Her skills had been exposed, her value as an asset had been demonstrated, and her safety now depended on community protection. The drive back to the airport gave her time to consider her options. She could accept community support and return to the world of classified operations and constant security concerns. She could attempt to maintain her civilian identity and hope that the threats would diminish over time. Or she could disappear entirely, abandoning her current life and starting over somewhere else with a completely new identity. None of the options appealed to her. Each involved sacrificing something important, whether it was her independence, her safety, or her connection to the life she'd built over the past 3 years. Elena's phone buzzed with a message from David Park. Elena, reporters are asking questions about our emergency procedures yesterday. I'm sticking to standard protocols, but they seem interested in specific details about how you controlled the aircraft. Anything I should know? Elena appreciated Park's discretion, but his message highlighted another dimension of her security. Concerns. Media attention would inevitably lead to scrutiny of her background, and investigative reporters had resources and persistence that could uncover information that routine background checks might miss. She replied, David, keep everything focused on standard emergency procedures. The specific techniques were improvised based on the aircraft's condition. Nothing more than good pilot judgment under pressure. Park's response was immediate. Understood. But Elena, some of these reporters have aviation backgrounds. They're asking technical questions that suggest they know more about aircraft control systems than typical journalists. Elena felt a chill of recognition. If sophisticated adversaries were targeting civilian aviation, they would certainly use intelligence-gathering operations to understand how their attacks had been defeated. Journalists with unusual technical knowledge might not be journalists at all. She called Wells immediately. Catherine, we may have a problem. Reporters are asking detailed technical questions about yesterday's emergency procedures. Questions that suggest specialized knowledge of aircraft systems. Wells's response was immediate. Where are you now? Driving back to the airport for the NTSB interview. Change of plans. Take the next exit and follow the route I'm sending to your phone. We're moving the interview to a secure location. Elena's phone chimed with detailed driving instructions to an address she didn't recognize. The new location was in the opposite direction from the airport, toward a commercial district that would provide better security and surveillance options. As she changed course, Elena noticed a dark sedan that had been following her since leaving the briefing location. Professional surveillance, maintaining proper distance and positioning. She wasn't sure whether they were community assets providing protection or hostile actors conducting reconnaissance. Elena executed a series of turns designed to test the surveillance, using techniques she'd learned years earlier for detecting and evading pursuit. The sedan maintained contact but adjusted its positioning in ways that suggested professional training. Her phone rang with a call from Wells. Elena, we have eyes on your surveillance. They're friendly assets providing security during your movement. But we're also tracking 3 additional vehicles that may represent hostile surveillance. Elena checked her mirrors and identified the potential threats. 2 cars that could be conducting coordinated surveillance, and a van that had appeared at multiple points along her route. The opposition was well organized and operating with sophisticated techniques. Catherine, R. We dealing with foreign intelligence services? Possibly. Or very well-trained mercenaries working for someone with substantial resources. Either way, they represent a serious threat to your safety. Elena followed the route to a small office complex that appeared unremarkable from the outside, but had security features that indicated government use. Armed guards in civilian clothes, surveillance cameras positioned for optimal coverage, and electronic countermeasures equipment that would detect and defeat most listening devices. The NTSB interview took place in a conference room that had been configured for secure communications. Agent Mitchell was present, along with 2 additional investigators who introduced themselves as specialists in aircraft systems and pilot training protocols. Captain Vasquez, Agent Mitchell began. We've reviewed the preliminary findings from Flight 447's flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder. Your emergency procedures were highly effective but unconventional. Can you explain where you learned these techniques? Elena had rehearsed this moment during the drive. Agent Mitchell, my background includes test pilot training and experimental aircraft programs. Some of the control techniques I used were adapted from that experience. Can you be more specific about these programs? Elena provided the cover story that Marcus had developed, describing classified test programs that would explain her unusual skills without compromising ongoing operations. The investigators listened carefully, taking notes and asking follow-up questions that suggested they were familiar with military aviation protocols. Captain, the control inputs you use during the approach phase don't match any standard emergency procedures in commercial aviation training. They appear to be based on thrust vectoring techniques used in advanced military aircraft. Elena had expected this level of technical scrutiny. The aircraft's condition required improvised procedures. I adapted techniques from my previous experience to maintain control under circumstances that aren't covered in standard training. What specific aircraft did you fly during your test pilot career? Elena provided the aircraft designations included in her cover story. Experimental platforms that had existed but were now declassified. The information was technically accurate while avoiding references to programs that remained classified. The interview continued for 2 hours, with investigators probing every aspect of her emergency procedures and professional background. Elena maintained consistency with her cover story while providing enough technical detail to satisfy their curiosity without compromising operational security. Captain, one final question. Do you believe Flight 447 system failures were the result of mechanical problems or external interference? Elena had prepared for this question, but it still required careful consideration. Agent Mitchell, the failure pattern was unusual but not unprecedented. Uncontained engine failures can cause extensive collateral damage to aircraft systems. I'll leave the technical analysis to your investigation. After the interview, Elena met privately with Wells to assess how well the cover story had held up under scrutiny. The investigators had been thorough but hadn't pressed beyond the boundaries of the fabricated background. They seemed satisfied with the test pilot explanation, Wells observed. But they're clearly puzzled by the sophistication of your emergency procedures. Commercial pilots don't typically have that level of training in unusual control techniques. Elena nodded. The story will hold up as long as they don't dig too deeply into the specific programs I claim to have participated in. We've arranged for supporting documentation to be placed in the appropriate archives. If investigators request additional verification, they'll find records that support your background. Wells activated a secure display showing the latest intelligence analysis of the attacks on civilian aircraft. Elena, we've made progress in identifying the source of these attacks. The technical capabilities involved point to a specific organization with connections to both foreign intelligence services and international criminal networks. Elena studied the analysis, noting the sophisticated nature of the threat they were facing. Are we talking about terrorism or espionage? Both. The attacks appear to be testing the vulnerabilities of civilian aviation systems while simultaneously eliminating specific targets who possess sensitive information. Elena thought about Dr. Sterling and his Defense Department consulting work. So Flight 447 was chosen because of Sterling, but the attack method was designed to test whether their weapons could be defeated. Exactly. Your successful emergency landing has provided them with valuable information about potential countermeasures, which is why you're now a high-priority target. Wells brought up security assessments and protection protocols. Elena, we've identified at least 6 hostile operatives who have entered the country since Flight 447's emergency landing. They're here for you. Elena felt the familiar weight of being hunted by people who possessed skills and resources that matched her own. What kind of protection are you offering? Complete community support, new identity, relocation to a secure facility, family protection, and assignment to a classified program that can make use of your unique capabilities. Elena understood that accepting community protection would mean returning permanently to the world she'd tried to escape. And if I decline? Then you'll be on your own against adversaries who have demonstrated the ability to destroy commercial aircraft and eliminate witnesses. Elena, these people don't take prisoners. They eliminate threats. The choice was no choice at all. Elena could accept community protection and lose her civilian life, or she could maintain her independence and likely lose her life entirely. The decision had been made for her the moment she'd chosen to save her passengers using skills that officially didn't exist. Catherine, I'll accept community support, but I want guarantees about my family's safety and my eventual ability to return to civilian life if the threat is neutralized. Wells nodded. Agreed. Your sister and other family members will receive protection and will work toward restoring your civilian identity once the investigation is complete and the threat has been eliminated. Elena's phone buzzed with a message from Captain Morrison. Elena, Continental wants to give you a commendation for yesterday's emergency landing. Company's planning a ceremony next week. You've become a real hero around here. Elena showed the message to Wells, who shook her head grimly. Public ceremonies would make you an easy target. We'll need to decline on your behalf. Elena realized that her heroic actions had created a public persona that was incompatible with the security requirements of her situation. She couldn't safely accept recognition for saving her passengers because doing so would expose her to the same enemies who'd tried to kill them. How do we handle the media attention and company recognition? Standard protocols for protecting assets under threat. Medical leave for stress-related issues, family emergency requiring extended absence. Anything that removes you from public view while maintaining your cover story. Elena understood that her career as a commercial pilot was effectively over, at least for the foreseeable future. She'd traded her civilian life for the safety of her passengers and her family, and there was no clear path back to the normalcy she'd once taken for granted. Wells handed her a secure phone and a packet of documents. Elena, transportation to a safe house has been arranged. You'll remain there while we develop plans for neutralizing the threat and determining your long-term assignment. Elena gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the life she'd built over the past 3 years. Her apartment, her routine, her identity as Captain Elena Vasquez would all become part of a past that officially didn't exist. As she left the secure facility, Elena reflected on the irony of her situation. She'd become a hero by saving 218 lives, but accepting that heroism had cost her the life she'd worked so hard to build. She was returning to a world of shadows and secrets, where her greatest accomplishments would never be publicly acknowledged and her sacrifice would remain invisible to those she'd protected. The safe house was located in a remote area outside the city, surrounded by agricultural land that provided excellent sight lines and limited approach routes. Elena arrived after dark, noting the security measures that had been implemented to protect her during the transition period. Marcus was waiting for her in the main room, along with 2 other operatives who would serve as her protection detail. The atmosphere was professional but tense, reflecting the seriousness of the threats that had emerged from Flight 447's emergency landing. "Elena, I'm sorry it came to this," Marcus said as she settled into the secure environment. "We hoped the community support would be temporary, but the intelligence picture has deteriorated rapidly." Elena nodded, accepting the reality of her situation. "Marcus, I need to understand the long-term plan. How do we eliminate this threat and restore some version of normal life?" Marcus activated a secure briefing system. The attacks on civilian aircraft are part of a larger operation designed to test vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure. Aviation is just one target set. They're also probing vulnerabilities in power grids, communications networks, and transportation systems. Elena studied the scope of the threat analysis. This isn't just about terrorism. This is preparation for something much larger. Exactly. We believe we're looking at the preliminary phase of a coordinated attack on multiple infrastructure targets. The organization responsible has been developing capabilities for years, and they're now moving into the testing phase before launching major operations. Elena understood the implications. "And my role is to help develop countermeasures based on my experience with Flight 447. Marcus nodded. "Your emergency procedures prove that their aviation attacks can be defeated. We need to systematize those techniques and train other pilots to use them. But we also need to understand their broader capabilities and develop responses for their other target sets." Elena realized that her return to the community would involve much more than aviation security. She'd become a key asset in a national security operation with global implications. "Marcus, what about the promise to eventually restore my civilian life?" Marcus's expression was sympathetic but realistic. "Elena, that depends on how this develops. If we can neutralize the threat quickly and eliminate the organization responsible, civilian life might be possible. But if this evolves into a long-term conflict, your capabilities will remain too valuable to the community to allow complete separation." Elena had suspected as much. People with her skills rarely achieved permanent retirement from the community. There was always another crisis, another situation where those capabilities became essential for national security. That evening, Elena sat on the safe house porch, looking out over the Kansas farmland and reflecting on the transformation her life had undergone in just 2 days. She'd entered this week as a commercial pilot dealing with workplace discrimination and career challenges. She was ending it as a classified asset in a national security operation with global implications. But as she thought about the faces of her passengers, their gratitude for being safely returned to their families, Elena knew she'd made the right choices. She'd used whatever skills were necessary to protect innocent lives, and she'd accepted whatever consequences those actions created. The investigation would continue, threats would be assessed, and countermeasures would be developed. Elena would contribute her expertise to protecting civilian aviation and critical infrastructure from attacks that most people would never know had been attempted. Her heroic emergency landing had saved 218 lives in one dramatic moment. But her real contribution would be the quiet work of preventing future attacks, protecting thousands of potential victims who would never know their safety depended on lessons learned from Flight 447's impossible approach to Kansas City International Airport. The community had reclaimed her, but Elena had reclaimed something more important, the knowledge that her skills and sacrifice served a purpose larger than personal comfort or career advancement. She was protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, using capabilities that few possessed to stand between innocent civilians and threats they couldn't imagine. Elena's phone displayed one final message of the day from a passenger she'd saved. "Captain Vasquez, my family and I will never forget what you did for us. You're a true hero, and we're grateful beyond words." Elena smiled as she read the message, then deleted it according to security protocols. The passenger would never know that her heroic pilot had disappeared into a world where recognition was forbidden and sacrifice went unacknowledged. But the gratitude would remain, a reminder that some actions transcend the boundaries between shadow and light, between classified operations and civilian life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and dangerous assignments. But tonight, Elena allowed herself the satisfaction of knowing that when it mattered most, she'd chosen courage over safety and service over self-preservation. The cost had been higher than she'd anticipated, but the value of the lives she'd saved made every sacrifice worthwhile. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.